Imagine this. Your wife says she wants more freedom, but that's just the beginning. She comes home with another man, invests your money without your permission, and openly starts ignoring the family. And when you try to figure out what's happening, everything turns against you. What would you do as the truth about her actions begins to surface? Betrayal, manipulation, and a fight for control. This is a story you won't forget. Will he have the strength to turn the tables? Without obligations, but with consequences. Is it possible to love without fear? Nolan was late again. He was always late, but today it mattered more than usual. The rain pounded against the windows of his car as if trying to mirror his feelings. Life felt unreal, gray, like this endless rain. He couldn't quite put his finger on why everything felt off. Maybe it was just one of those weary days, stretching out like a gray piece of fabric refusing to find its shape. But the closer he got to home, the stronger the unease grew, like someone was there, unseen but present. When Nolan opened the door, he felt it immediately, the silence. Perhaps it was just a typical late evening where Scarlett had already put their son to bed and was probably in another room, busy with her own things. But this silence was unusual. It was almost oppressive. He carefully hung his coat on the rack, each step echoing loudly in the empty hallway. He walked to their bedroom, a creeping anxiety shadowing his every move. He didn't understand why his heart felt so uneasy. The room was dark, but the faint glow of the bedside lamp cast soft light, piercing through the shadows. That's when Nolan noticed the first clue, her wedding ring. It lay on the blanket, as if carelessly left behind. Nolan picked up the ring and examined it. He instantly knew it wasn't accidental. This wasn't like her. Scarlett always wore the ring. Always. Even when she was busy or tired, she never took it off. The feeling that something was wrong only deepened. And then he saw something else, a piece of fabric on the floor. Nolan stepped closer. It was part of Scarlett's lingerie, familiar in texture and color. He couldn't understand how it ended up there. All these things felt foreign, left without explanation. Deep down, he sensed this wasn't just evening clutter. This was something more. He approached the window and looked out at the street, the familiar dark road he always saw from this very spot. The rain poured heavily, but somehow, he felt lonelier than ever. It was as if nothing connected him to this room, this woman, this family anymore. Scarlett had always been at the center of it all, but now, standing in the darkness, it felt like everything had vanished. She had vanished, leaving only these strange signs behind. Nolan's heart raced. He wanted answers, an explanation. He decided to check the rest of the house for clues. As he walked through the rooms, he felt the gaze of objects bearing the traces of life, but now appearing like mere props. When he entered the kitchen, the emptiness struck him again. No sounds, no aroma of her favorite tea that she always sipped in the evenings. Everything was eerily quiet. And then he heard it, a faint crunching sound outside the door. Footsteps. Nolan froze, his heart pounding in his throat. It was her shadow, but this time, it felt different. He stood there, unsure whether to keep searching or step back. But as soon as he turned toward the door, the footsteps grew louder. The door opened, and Scarlett stood there. Her expression was serious, almost cold. She looked at him but said nothing. Nolan felt the seconds stretch into eternity. He couldn't understand what had just happened or what had changed. A moment ago, they were just a couple, a family. Now, "I found your ring," Nolan said, holding it up with a slight tilt of his head. She said nothing. "And a piece of your clothing. Did you go somewhere?" She looked at him and, with a deep sigh, replied, "Nolan, don't ask. You don't want to know." His heart trembled again. What did that mean? Why couldn't she answer him directly? Why did everything feel so alien? "Scarlett," he said more firmly, "why? What are you hiding from me?" She raised her hand, as if brushing off his question, and slowly walked past him without answering. "Don't destroy what we have, Nolan." Her words came out sharp, like a slap. She didn't even turn to face him, just walked away, as if he were no longer part of her world. Nolan stood frozen, holding her ring, feeling like she had just walked out of his life forever. He stared at the objects in his hands and realized he wasn't ready to face the truth. But something within him was already shifting. Whatever it was, he knew the answer wouldn't be what he expected. Nolan increasingly felt like a stranger in his own home. Just months ago, their house had been filled with laughter and the warmth of family evenings. Now, it felt empty. Leo, their son, was the only bright spot in his day, but even their moments together couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. It was as if she were drifting away, and even the smallest hints of her strange behavior did not go unnoticed. She started staying late at work, often not coming home in the evenings. At times, Nolan couldn't find her either at home or on her mobile phone. She seemed to disappear, leaving him alone with his doubts and worries. One evening, as he sat at the table looking through family photos, Nolan realized how hard it was for him to focus on anything else. He stared at the pictures where they all looked so happy, unable to pinpoint when it had all changed. He loved Scarlett. She still mattered deeply to him, but these past months, they had been like a shadow engulfing their relationship. How would things change? What had happened to her? Nolan decided to talk to her, but every time he tried, Scarlett always found reasons to avoid the conversation. Now's not the time, Nolan. We'll talk later. But that later never came. One day, when Nolan came home early from work, he saw the same wedding ring on the bed again. This time, she couldn't hide it. It had become too obvious. "Scarlett, we need to talk," he said, walking into the room where she was getting ready to leave. Scarlett stopped, her face turning serious. She glanced at Nolan, then back at her clothes. She looked as though she was pondering where to begin. "I know something is going on, Scarlett. You've changed." His voice was quiet but firm. He didn't want to come across as someone trying to control her life, but he could no longer ignore the changes. She stood silently, as if searching for the right words. After a few seconds, she looked him in the eye. "Nolan, I don't want to hide this anymore, but I'm changing, and I can't live the way you want me to." Her words sounded like she was letting go of something that had once been important to both of them. Nolan couldn't believe it. He didn't know exactly what she meant, but his intuition told him this wasn't going to be an easy conversation. "What do you mean?" He stepped closer to her, but she backed away, creating both physical and emotional distance between them. "I don't want to live in this kind of relationship anymore, Nolan. I don't want to be confined. I want freedom, and I want us to live differently. Without obligations." She said it as if the phrase was a new reality for her. Her tone was cold but tinged with a hint of despair. Nolan felt his world shift around him. His heart started racing, and he couldn't collect his thoughts. "Without obligations? Scarlett, we're married. We have a son," he replied, trying to understand if she was joking. But her eyes didn't waver. She was serious. "We can't live in a trap, Nolan. I know this is painful for you, but I can't keep living within these limits. Do you want me to be your possession?" Her words grew sharper, piercing his soul. Nolan was stunned. This was a new reality he didn't know how to handle. He loved Scarlett. He had never imagined she could want something like this. Scarlett calmed herself and said, "I'm sorry for saying this to you. I'm probably just tired and need to rest." She hugged Nolan and kissed him, and they went to bed together. Nolan was deeply troubled, but didn't fully understand what Scarlett was trying to say. The next morning, Nolan woke up feeling as though he were trapped in a dream that had become real. He watched Scarlett sleeping quietly beside him, her face serene and free of the stern expression that had often appeared lately. She was still a source of warmth and beauty to him, but her recent words left him anxious. He couldn't grasp what was really happening. Her request for rest seemed suspicious, but he wasn't ready to break the silence. Was it just a moment of exhaustion, or something more that she couldn't, or wouldn't, say? The sense of unease and disappointment lingered. All those hours when Scarlett was away, staying late at work or dealing with her personal matters, became increasingly clear to him. Why had she started behaving this way? What had changed in her life? Was there someone else? These questions tormented him, making him doubt everything that once seemed stable and right. Scarlett was a beautiful woman, and Nolan understood that her natural charisma couldn't leave anyone indifferent. She was not only creative, but also ambitious. She had a strong desire for success, which often became a source of her inner tension. In her relationship with Nolan, she often sought independence, though there had always been a deep emotional connection between them. But something had changed. Her desire to avoid obligations was growing stronger. In the morning, when Scarlett woke up, her expression was calm, but Nolan noticed that she didn't look at him the way she used to. She didn't ask how he felt after their difficult conversation. She simply said she had some errands to run and would probably stay late at work again. Her tone was once more reserved. "All right," Nolan replied, trying to keep his composure. "Just be careful, okay?" Scarlett nodded, quickly gathered her things, and left, leaving the door slightly ajar behind her. Nolan remained in the room, feeling empty. He was on the edge but didn't know what to do next. He loved her, but what now? How could he win back her trust? A storm of thoughts swirled in his mind. He couldn't wait any longer. He had no right to remain in the dark. Should he take her laptop? Check her personal messages? Nolan didn't want to be that kind of man. But did he have another choice? Their son Leo was playing on the floor in his room when Nolan, gathering all his courage, approached the desk where Scarlett had left her laptop. He held his breath and entered the passcode she had once freely shared with him. As expected, he found an unusual number of unread messages. The more he scrolled, the harder his heart pounded. There it was, a particular phrase he had seen before but never thought much of: "Time to meet again." The message repeated itself several times, and the growing tension inside him became almost unbearable. "Scarlett, why are you hiding this?" he whispered to himself, trying to calm down. Was it just an innocent exchange? Or was it something more? Nolan knew he needed to see more than just those words, and he decided to take the next step. His hands felt heavy as he scrolled through her photo gallery. Most of the pictures were ordinary family moments, but one photo shocked him. It was recent, taken at a holiday party. Scarlett stood next to a man who wasn't Nolan. They were laughing, and the man's hand rested on her back. Nolan didn't recognize him, but his heart clenched in pain. This wasn't just a friend or a colleague. It seemed like the answer to his questions was within arm's reach. Nolan tried not to let his emotions show, but deep inside, he was forced to acknowledge that his suspicions had become reality. Another question then formed in his mind. What am I going to do about this? Nolan sat at the desk, his gaze fixed on the laptop screen, lingering on the image of Scarlett smiling with the stranger. His heart was heavy, but his face betrayed none of his emotions. He composed himself and made a decision that didn't quite align with his nature. He had to act preemptively. Since learning what had happened between them, Nolan had been teetering on the edge. It seemed his world had turned upside down, and he realized Scarlett wanted to change the rules of their relationship. Now, he felt he needed to prepare to respond to her desires, but with a strategy of his own in mind. When Scarlett walked through the door that evening, Nolan steeled himself and decided to talk. He watched her demeanor, her smile that seemed superficial. She looked the same, yet slightly foreign, as she had throughout this time. In his heart, there was no longer any doubt. He was no longer the man he had been before. "Nolan, are you here?" Her voice sounded cautious, as if she didn't want to disturb the silence. She immediately noticed the tension in his face. "Yes, Scarlett. We need to talk about your work," Nolan replied, trying to keep his voice calm, though it was hard for him to organize his thoughts. "My work?" Her eyes widened. She didn't understand what he meant. It seemed like an unease she hadn't anticipated. "I think you don't need to work anymore. You can quit if you want more freedom, like you said." Nolan observed her reaction, his voice steady, though he felt his heart tightening. Scarlett was taken aback. She looked into his eyes and then tried to smile, but it was strained. It was as if she didn't know how to respond to such a suggestion. She lived in a world where her ambitions were important, and her work was her personal space. "Nolan, are you serious?" she asked, trying to gauge his intentions. She cautiously sat next to him on the couch. "Yes, I'm serious. If you want more freedom, you can pursue something you love. Maybe an online business, if that's what you want," he said, trying not to reveal the storm of emotions within him. Her expression shifted. At first, she looked puzzled, but then she smiled. It was the same smile Nolan had seen at the start of their relationship when she dreamed of something bigger. She had always sought independence, and this opportunity seemed perfect. "I can't believe you're saying this, but it's It's wonderful. I've dreamed of starting my own business. I've wanted this so much, she exclaimed, barely containing her joy. The look on her face was full of energy Nolan hadn't seen in a long time. I can allocate money for you to do what you want. If you decide to go for it, I'll support you, he said, maintaining his composure. His voice was calm, though deep down, he knew this decision was part of his plan. It wasn't the final step toward resolution, but it was definitely going to change the course of their relationship. Scarlett stood up and hugged him, wrapping her arms around his neck. You have no idea how much this means to me. This is the chance I've been waiting for, she said, her happiness evident. Nolan even began to doubt whether he was making the right move, but his face betrayed no hesitation. They shared champagne, and Leo, their little son, thrilled to have both parents at home and happy, laughed and ran around them. Scarlett was at the height of her joy, and Nolan also felt that this moment was something they both deserved. She silently gazed at him, her eyes speaking more than any words. She couldn't contain her emotions, and her happiness was now at its peak. It kept playing over and over in his mind. He hadn't yet told her about it, and while he had decided to allow her more freedom, he couldn't let go of his doubts. Meanwhile, Scarlett was dreaming of her fresh start. Plans were already forming in her mind, and she couldn't wait to begin making her dreams a reality. But Nolan knew one thing. Their relationship was changing, and what came next was unknown. This was only the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. Scarlett sat in her new office, which she had rented using Nolan's money. She stared at her computer screen, opening new tabs and searching for business ideas that aligned with her vision of freedom. A feeling of incredible lightness overwhelmed her. She was independent, she could do whatever she wanted, and nothing was supposed to hold her back. For the first time in years, she truly felt free. Now that Nolan was giving her the chance to focus on her work, she could finally pursue her dreams. And it was all thanks to his financial support. But even this newfound freedom couldn't silence what was troubling her. She was forced to confront the reality that her world wasn't as perfect as it seemed. She began to realize how long she had been hiding her dissatisfaction. She hadn't been ready for motherhood. Leo was more of a burden than a joy for her. And while she loved her son, she couldn't ignore the fact that her life had worsened since his birth. Scarlett felt liberated as she gained access to Nolan's various bank accounts. There was a significant amount of money there, and she realized that having a child had been a torment for her. She didn't want children as much as Nolan did, and she decided that Leo would now be under the full-time care of a nanny. She told Nolan about it, and while his reaction was ambiguous, he agreed, especially since he himself didn't have much time to spend with Leo during the weekdays. While little Leo stayed with the nanny, Nolan kept an eye on Scarlett. He wanted to see how exactly she planned to build this freedom she had dreamed of so much. He watched her new plans closely, but his suspicions grew. He tried not to let his emotions get the better of him, but several moments made him wary. He noticed Scarlett was going out more often, frequently staying late with friends or attending parties where he wasn't invited. He no longer believed her words about needing alone time. It wasn't just a desire for personal space. It was an attempt to hide from him, from his attention. "Scarlett, where are you going?" he asked one evening as she was getting ready to leave. "Just to a party with the girls, Nolan." "You know I need some time alone," she replied, quickly dressing and glancing at him. Nolan looked at her face, her nervous but determined expression, and felt his suspicions grow even stronger. "Are you sure everything's okay?" he asked, trying to hide the concern in his voice. "Yes, everything's fine. I just want to be with my friends." "Don't worry," she replied, but her eyes didn't meet his, and he felt the emptiness of her words. As soon as the door closed behind her, Nolan sat down on the couch and began to think. He realized his wife was drifting further away. He even started to doubt whether her desire for alone time and focusing on her own business was genuine. The sense of unease didn't leave him, and although he didn't want to become controlling, the urge to uncover the truth was too strong. Meanwhile, Scarlett was experiencing changes in her life. She started doing things she hadn't been able to do before, attending parties, reconnecting with friends she hadn't seen much since Leo's birth. With her new strategy, she began building her online business, which brought in decent money. Scarlett felt she had more control over her life, filling her with a sense of power. She could no longer be just a wife and mother. She wanted more. But despite it all, she couldn't forget about Nolan. She loved him, and it was a hard truth for her to face. At the same time, she couldn't be one of those women who lived in the shadow of their husbands. She wanted to maintain her independence, regaining the individuality she had lost after becoming a mother. How did this happen? She thought, sitting in a restaurant with her friends, trying to avoid thoughts about Nolan. She knew her husband suspected her, but that didn't stop her from wanting to make her life exactly the way she wanted it. Nolan, meanwhile, couldn't shake his suspicions. He didn't know exactly what was going on, but every move she made seemed distant. It made him pay even more attention to her life, even as she reassured him that everything was fine. He tried not to interfere, but with each passing day, his observations became harder to ignore. One evening, when Scarlett came home after another party, Nolan was already waiting for her. He sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, staring out the window. She walked in and shut the door behind her. "You're late again," Nolan said in a calm but clear voice. "Nolan, we've talked about this. I just need some time alone with my friends." "It doesn't mean anything," she replied, trying not to sound guilty, though her eyes betrayed a certain nervousness. "I know, but I'm not sure you're being honest with me. Something has changed, Scarlett. We can't keep talking about alone time. This feels more like an escape." His voice turned serious. She loved Nolan, but this freedom she had gained meant something different to her, and she wasn't ready to give up on her new ambitions. "I just want to be myself, Nolan. I don't want to be just your wife and a mother. I need more," she said, trying to explain that her desire for more freedom didn't mean she didn't love him. Nolan didn't respond. He simply looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that Scarlett couldn't decipher. Perhaps it was disappointment, or maybe it was simply the realization that something in their relationship had changed. Nolan sat in the living room, staring at the wall, feeling as if every moment was pulling him further away from the woman he once loved. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but he couldn't quite pinpoint what it was. Scarlett had changed, and while he tried to remain calm, doubts continued to torment him. "Scarlett, you're hardly spending any time with Leo. Our child is with the nanny all the time," Nolan said again, watching as she typed a message on her phone, paying no attention to their son, who was sitting with the nanny in another room. "I told you it's just temporary," Scarlett replied without looking up from her screen. "I'll take a break, and everything will be fine. Then I'll spend more time with him." "Scarlett, this isn't temporary anymore. It's constant." Nolan couldn't hold back any longer. "The nanny spends more time with Leo than you do. You said you wanted to be a mother. And what about your business? What are you expecting from it?" Scarlett sighed deeply and put her phone down on the table. "We've talked about this, Nolan. I'm working on my project, and I know how important it is to be with Leo, but I can't just sit at home all the time. I need some space for myself." Nolan tried to understand her perspective. He didn't want to be the kind of man who controlled his wife's every move. But something was wrong. Scarlett had become different, and he could feel it. She was growing more distant from him, less attentive, her gaze often fixed on her phone or elsewhere, rather than on him or their child. "Scarlett," Nolan paused, trying not to escalate the situation. "You've changed. You're not the same as you were before. I just want to understand what's happening." Scarlett looked at him and sighed. "Don't be dramatic, Nolan. I haven't changed. I just want to be independent, that's all." She quickly got up and walked out onto the balcony to get some fresh air. Nolan sat there, watching her leave. His heart was beating faster, and doubts swirled in his mind. She really had changed. What else had he missed? A few minutes later, Scarlett came back into the room, and Nolan immediately smelled smoke. His face twisted in surprise. "Have you started smoking?" he asked, looking at her as though he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Scarlett froze mid-step, her eyes glinting involuntarily. "Sometimes, but don't worry, I won't smoke around Leo. It's just a few cigarettes a day." Nolan couldn't believe his ears. She had never smoked before, and now this new habit, which he hadn't even suspected, had appeared. What had happened to the Scarlett he knew? Why had she suddenly turned to these ways of escaping reality? It was yet another small signal that something was wrong. He remained silent as she returned to what she was doing. He didn't want to make a scene, but the doubts continued to gnaw at him. If only he had concrete proof that something was going on. But there was nothing, just small signs. She was less attentive to him, more preoccupied with her phone, and now this strange smell. Every time he tried to bring up her behavior, she would brush it off or redirect the conversation to other topics. Time and time again, he kept coming back to the thought that maybe he was overreacting. But what if he wasn't? Nolan began to notice that Scarlett often kept her phone on silent mode, and when he tried to see what she was doing, she would quickly hide it or change the subject. It had become obvious. He didn't want to be the kind of husband who constantly monitored his wife's every move, but he couldn't shake his suspicions. Late at night, after Scarlett had fallen asleep, Nolan sat in silence, thinking. He had no proof, but his gut told him something wasn't right. He decided not to act hastily, but he also couldn't let it go unnoticed. He needed more information. Maybe he should find out who she was talking to. Maybe there was something more hidden behind this newfound freedom. Still, he couldn't just invade her privacy. Scarlett was his wife, and he respected her personal boundaries. But how could he respect those boundaries when his heart was racing with doubts and uncertainty? Every time he tried to talk to her, she would wave it off, and each time, his doubts grew stronger. He couldn't understand why she had changed so much. Why had she started hiding things she had once been open about? Could it just be a coincidence? Or was there something more behind all of this? Nolan decided not to rush. He tried to remain calm and composed, but his mind was full of worries. He didn't want to lose Scarlett, but he also couldn't ignore what he was feeling. With every new signal, he felt more like a man chasing a shadow, trying to grasp the truth, but it remained out of reach. Another day passed, and Nolan sat at his desk, staring at his laptop. Scarlett had left again, saying she needed to take care of important business matters. He increasingly felt like a stranger in his own home. He didn't understand why Scarlett had grown so distant, and what troubled him most was that she didn't share her plans with him. He tried not to appear suspicious, but at every turn, something didn't add up. Nolan was sitting on the couch when he heard a car braking outside. The door opened, and in walked Scarlett with a man accompanying her. Nolan looked up, and his eyes settled on the unfamiliar man. Scarlett smiled when she saw Nolan, but her smile wasn't like before. She appeared cheerful, yet there was a cold confidence in her eyes. The man following her was large, with broad shoulders and strong arms. His suit fit him perfectly, emphasizing his status and strength. He moved with assurance, as if he already belonged in this house, almost as if he owned it. "Nolan, this is John," Scarlett said, her voice sounding as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "We've known each other for a long time, and now he's my business partner." Nolan couldn't hide his confusion. He looked at Scarlett, then at John, who was already standing in the room as if it were his place. Nolan watched as John gave him a firm handshake, immediately noting how confident this man was. It was so evident that even Nolan felt uncomfortable. "Hi, Nolan," John said in a rough but friendly tone. "Scarlett has told me a lot about you. I hope everything is going well for you." Nolan felt as if he were standing before an unbeatable comrade who always knew what to do. He couldn't shake this feeling but tried to remain calm. "I'm glad you two have found common ground," Nolan said, trying not to reveal his unease. Scarlett, noticing his reaction, quickly added, "Nolan, John has helped me with a few important business matters. He's very talented. Last night, we worked late at the office, and it was so productive." Nolan just nodded, but his heart was racing. He didn't understand what was happening. She hadn't asked for his permission, hadn't discussed it with him, and now she had simply brought this man into their lives as if it were nothing. "And," John continued, "Scarlett has invested $200,000 in our company. She'll become one of our investors, which will give her a significant stake in the business. This is a major step, and I'm confident it'll bring her great dividends." Nolan felt his heart tighten. $200,000? That was his money. She didn't have permission to manage such a large sum without consulting him. She hadn't discussed this with him, and now that money was tied to a business he knew nothing about. He held himself back from yelling. Is this serious?" he said, his voice tinged with confusion. Why didn't you tell me about this, Scarlett? Scarlett seemed unfazed by his concern, even trying to appear calm. I thought it was the right move for us, Nolan. John is very talented. I decided it was the best thing for both of us. You understand how important this is for our future. John, as if trying to support her, added, Nolan, I know this might seem sudden, but we have great potential, and we're happy Scarlett has joined us. If you'd like to be part of this project too, we're always open to collaboration. Nolan stayed silent, his thoughts swirling like a wild hurricane. All this money, this new partnership, how long had this been going on? Why hadn't Scarlett told him about it? And, most importantly, who was this man? Why did he act as if he were already part of their family? I think we should discuss this later, Nolan said, trying not to show how much the situation bothered him. Now's not the best time for this conversation. Scarlett smiled again, as if nothing unusual had happened. Of course, Nolan. This is important, but we'll find time for everything. You don't mind if we stay for dinner, do you? Nolan nodded, though his heart was anything but calm. He felt like he was at someone else's celebration, where no one cared about his opinion. It all seemed as if Scarlett was running the show, and even though he didn't want to admit it, he felt like she had been in charge for a long time, while he was left in the shadows. They sat down for dinner, and the evening went on, but for Nolan, it felt like another loss. A loss of control over what was happening in his life and what Scarlett was really hiding. Nolan sat at the table, feeling his heart pounding in his chest. He tried to stay composed, but he felt increasingly uncomfortable in his own home. John, with his confidence and charisma, had entered their lives suddenly and without warning, almost like a new member of the family. All the subtle hints and compliments Scarlett directed at John raised more questions in Nolan's mind, questions that had no answers. Of course, make yourself at home, Nolan said, trying to maintain control, even though inside, his mind and heart were in turmoil. John, sitting next to Scarlett, leaned back in his chair, looking at Nolan with a slight smile that radiated self-assurance. Thanks, I appreciate it. I wouldn't mind a beer. Could you grab me one? I'd like to relax a bit after a long day. You don't mind, do you, Nolan? Nolan paused for a moment, gathered himself, and simply nodded. He didn't have the energy to argue further. He was too unsettled. Sure, I'll bring it, he said and walked to the fridge. He didn't understand what was truly happening. Why was Scarlett acting this way with John? What had happened to his wife? And why did he feel as though this situation was completely unsettling him? His thoughts were interrupted by Scarlett, who started talking about her new car. Nolan, you won't believe it. John helped me get a new car, a Tesla X, the one you used to dream about. It's an amazing opportunity that came because I'm now an investor in their company, Scarlett said enthusiastically, her eyes shining with excitement. She looked so happy that it seemed to push Nolan further away. She was no longer the same person she had been just a few months ago. Although Nolan wasn't a poor man, he had always valued frugality. Spending large sums on luxury items was something he didn't consider necessary, so Scarlett's new Tesla seemed strange to him. It was an incredibly expensive car, and he couldn't understand why she hadn't told him about it earlier. Was this part of a plan Scarlett had secretly been carrying out? That's quite a surprise, Nolan said, trying not to reveal his startled reaction. But why didn't you discuss this with me beforehand? Scarlett simply smiled and said, I didn't want to bother you with the small details. Besides, it's just a little bonus for my investment. John, who was sitting next to her, raised an eyebrow and chimed in, I'll say more, Nolan. If Scarlett continues working as successfully as she did last night, I might give her more than just a car. All attention turned to John, and his words carried a sense of self-importance that Nolan couldn't ignore. This wasn't just a business partner. This was a man who had an extraordinarily strong influence on Scarlett. His tone was not only professional, but also somewhat personal. John and I worked late into the night, Scarlett continued, tilting her head slightly toward him. And I know that if we keep working together like this, everything will be amazing. I feel so lucky to have such a partner. Nolan froze, listening to her words. He felt something deeper than suspicion stirring within him. It was jealousy, slowly consuming his heart, Yet he couldn't do anything about it. All these compliments, the casual ease in her words, they were tearing him apart inside. "You're really amazing, John. I'm so lucky," Scarlett added, her voice softening in a way that further unsettled Nolan. He felt his chest tighten, but forced himself to smile. What could he say? What could he do? Scarlett was no longer the woman he used to know. Suddenly, Scarlett turned to him. "Where's our son?" Nolan sighed, trying to stay calm. "I took him to your mother's because the nanny wanted a day off." Scarlett seemed pleased. "Oh, that's great. Then we can spend some time alone. John, you don't mind staying the night with us, do you?" Nolan felt as if the ground was slipping from under his feet. How was this possible? How could she ask this with such a calm expression, as if nothing unusual had happened? She didn't even seem surprised. It was as if John was already a part of their life. John, without hesitation, replied, "Of course, I don't mind. That would be nice." Gathering all his willpower, Nolan quietly nodded. "Yes, I agree." It was painful. It was unbearably painful to see how his home, his family, was changing under the influence of this man. But he had no choice. He couldn't stop it until he understood what was really happening. The evening continued, but for Nolan, it wasn't just dinner. It was a new reality in which he was no longer in control, and he didn't know if he could withstand these changes. Nolan felt his nerves fraying. He didn't understand why everything was unfolding this way. What kind of game were Scarlett and John pulling him into? And why did he, a man who had always been in control, feel as if he were losing his grip? John, evidently deciding that since he was staying the night, it was time to drink something stronger. "Well, Nolan, since I'm staying, how about we have something better to drink?" "What do you have?" he asked, glancing at the shelves stocked with alcohol. Nolan hesitated for a moment. He rarely drank, but his house always had premium alcohol, rum, vodka, and whiskey gifted to him by business partners. Now, with his heart weighed down by anxiety, he decided it was time to unwind. Maybe it would help him momentarily escape everything happening around him. "I have some good whiskey. I'll open it," he said, trying to maintain composure. He opened a bottle and poured 3 full glasses. John, seemingly unfazed by anything, began drinking while keeping an eye on Scarlett. She was entirely focused on the conversation, laughing, drinking, and everything appeared so peaceful. If not for the growing unease in Nolan's chest, it would have seemed like an ordinary evening. But his nerves couldn't take it anymore. He felt trapped, though he tried to keep a facade of calm. After a few glasses, Nolan began to realize he was losing control of himself. He took another sip, but with each drink, it became harder to keep his head steady. At first, it seemed insignificant, but after 2 glasses of whiskey, Nolan felt his clarity slipping away. The alcohol weighed heavily in his stomach, but his mind grew cloudier with every passing moment. At the table, he leaned forward and closed his eyes. He just wanted to sleep, to disconnect from everything. His movements became slow and heavy, and eventually, he rested his head directly on the table, trying to find some relief, even if just for a moment. But then Nolan saw something that completely threw him off balance. He lifted his head and noticed John taking Scarlett's hand. They were sitting across from each other, their eyes meeting, and in that moment, John pulled Scarlett toward him, and she sat on his lap. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Nolan couldn't ignore it. Their movements became increasingly intimate. Scarlett began to embrace John, laughing softly, and they almost merged into a single figure. Nolan felt extremely uncomfortable. His eyes couldn't look away from the moment, even though he desperately tried not to watch. It was like a scene from a romantic film, but something about it felt so horribly wrong. He could feel his soul screaming from within, but he was powerless in the face of this situation. Suddenly, Scarlett stood up and said, "We're going to rest, John and I. You don't mind, do you, Nolan?" She glanced at him with an expression that could be interpreted as apologetic, but it held no trace of worry or guilt. She turned back to John, grabbed his hand, and they walked toward the bedroom together. "Thanks for everything, Nolan. Have a good rest," John said as he stood in the doorway, adding with his usual cold confidence, "Don't worry, We're just going to relax a bit. Nolan couldn't reply. He didn't even rise from his seat. His hands began to tremble, and his heart pounded so fiercely it felt like it might burst. He couldn't summon the strength to stand, and when he tried, he fell off the chair and onto the floor, quickly passing out as his consciousness faded into darkness. The night passed. By morning, Nolan woke up with a terrible headache. His throat was dry and sore, and his thoughts were muddled. He couldn't remember how much time had passed, but something had definitely happened. In the next moment, John appeared in the doorway, fully dressed and ready to leave. He didn't look as though anything was amiss. He even gave the impression that he hadn't just stayed over, but had made himself completely at home. "Well, Nolan, how are you?" John asked with a smile. He seemed as relaxed as ever. "Feeling better?" Nolan struggled to rise, looking at him again, but his words came out delayed. "Yes, a little," he mumbled, trying to maintain his composure. "But that's not all," John continued, pausing for effect, which made Nolan's heart race even faster. "You know your wife. She did everything to make sure I had a great time last night. So, take care and don't worry." Nolan tried to muster the strength to respond, but he was faced with a horrifying reality. What did this mean? What was he supposed to do about it? How could he ignore everything that had happened? John, still smiling, walked out, leaving Nolan alone with his thoughts. Nolan entered the bedroom, overwhelmed with emotions and confusion over what had transpired during the night. He found Scarlett sitting on the bed. She looked different, and he couldn't help but notice how unusual her demeanor was. She was dressed in lingerie, complete with stockings and a garter belt, her lips smeared with red lipstick. "Scarlett, what is this?" His voice cracked with desperation. "John just told me that you made him feel good. What does that mean? And why do you look like this?" Scarlett shrugged slightly, but her eyes carried an air of uncertainty. She didn't know where to begin, but knew the truth had to come out. "I should have told you earlier, Nolan." Her voice was calm, yet a hint of anxiety could be detected. "I feel like our relationship doesn't satisfy me anymore. I wanted something different, new experiences. And yes, John is part of what I've been searching for. I've been unfaithful to you, not just with John, but occasionally with other men." Nolan couldn't believe what he was hearing. He sat on the edge of the bed, shattered by pain and anger. His eyes brimmed with disappointment. "How could you? We have a child, Scarlett. You've taken everything I gave you for our home and thrown it all away?" His voice cracked, a mix of despair and growing rage. "Is this what you want? An open relationship?" Scarlett moved closer to him, her eyes now more open and honest. She hadn't wanted to reveal the truth before, but now it was all laid bare. She no longer wanted to hide her feelings. "Nolan, I didn't know how to tell you. I couldn't live within these constraints anymore. I want to feel free. John, he gave me something I couldn't find in you. Don't think I'm trying to hurt you, but he's better than you in many ways. I've wanted this for a long time, and I know it hurts." Nolan was in shock. His mind couldn't process what she was saying. It was so unexpected and devastating. He couldn't understand how everything had changed so drastically. How had this happened to their relationship, which once seemed perfect? "How can you say that? How can you compare me to him? I'm your husband, Scarlett. I've done everything for you and our family." His voice erupted with pain that he couldn't suppress. Scarlett fell silent for a moment, her gaze softening. "I understand that you're angry, and that's your reaction to what I've done," Scarlett said. "But maybe we can't live the way we used to anymore. I can't turn back time. You don't want this, Nolan, but I want to be honest with you." Nolan lowered his head into his hands. The whole situation was so tangled that he couldn't find answers to his questions. The world he had built seemed to be crumbling right before his eyes. "What do you want me to do?" His voice was quiet, an echo of what used to be his hopes. Scarlett moved a little closer, her hands gently touching him. She tried to find the right words, but even she struggled to understand what to do next. "I want you to understand me, Nolan. If we're going to stay together, we need to be honest. Maybe we should discuss how to move forward. But if you're not ready for that, I can't force you. We can continue as we are, but it will have to be an open relationship." Nolan clenched his fists, realizing he was at a crossroads. He loved his wife, but what she had said shattered all his notions of relationships and trust. He couldn't understand why this had happened, but he knew he needed to make a decision. "I don't know what to do. I don't want an open relationship," he said, his words heavy and uncertain. "How can anyone be happy after what you've just told me? Open relationships, that's too much." Scarlett stepped back, watching him. She understood that he was going through a difficult time and couldn't help him find answers quickly. "I don't know what to do next either, but I don't want to leave everything in the past. I want to give us a chance at a new understanding, but this will be an open relationship. You'll sponsor me, and I'll spend time with whoever I choose." Nolan stood there, watching Scarlett as she walked toward the window. He felt his heart pulling in different directions, his mind desperately searching for a way out of this labyrinth. He couldn't just come to terms with what had happened. He needed time to figure out if there was still a chance for their future, or if it was already over. But one thing was clear. He couldn't just let it all go. That same day, John arrived at Scarlett and Nolan's house again. John brazenly walked into the house as if he were the owner, not a guest. Nolan stood, trying to hide the storm of emotions raging inside him. His hands clenched into fists, but he took a deep breath, trying to keep himself under control. "John," Nolan said coldly, "no one invited you here." "Actually, I did," Scarlett interrupted with a smug smile. She was sitting on the couch, comfortably settled in as if nothing unusual had happened. "I've decided that John can come whenever he wants. After all, we're in an open relationship. You agreed to this yourself." Nolan sighed, trying not to show how much this infuriated him. "But inviting him here again, that's too much, Scarlett," he said, looking her directly in the eyes. John couldn't help but laugh loudly. "Are you really upset about this?" he asked Nolan with a maddening grin. Nolan replied calmly, "No, it's fine." Scarlett laughed along with John, but this reaction left Nolan with no choice. His mind worked at full speed. He realized that force or direct confrontation wouldn't get him anywhere. But that didn't mean he would give up. "Well, if that's what you want," Nolan added with feigned calmness, "but I need some time to think things over." Scarlett nodded, confident that she had everything under control. Nolan spent several hours alone in his study. He reflected on everything that had happened over the past few days and realized he needed a clear plan. If Scarlett and John wanted to play by their own rules, he would find a way to turn the game around. He pulled a folder with documents on the house from the shelf. It was titled in his name only. Then he opened his laptop and began compiling a list of lawyers who could help him in this situation. He wanted to make sure their child would stay with him if they ended up divorcing. The next morning, Nolan acted as if nothing had happened. He went to the kitchen, where Scarlett and John were having breakfast together. They looked as if they were completely ignoring his presence. "What are we doing today?" Nolan asked with a fake smile. "John and I are planning to go out for dinner," Scarlett replied without even looking at him. "That sounds great," Nolan said. "I have a few things to take care of myself." She didn't even notice how carefully Nolan was watching her every word and action. While they were out, Nolan began to act. He called his lawyer to find out how best to organize the divorce and ensure that the house and custody of their child would remain with him. He also decided to create a situation that would make Scarlett and John reconsider their actions. When Scarlett and John returned home late in the evening, they were greeted with a surprise. The living room was empty, and all of Nolan's belongings were gone. "What the?" Scarlett started, looking around the room. John simply smiled. Maybe he decided to leave? Couldn't take it anymore? But Scarlett knew this wasn't like Nolan. She went to check the bedroom, but instead of him, she found a note on the pillow. "Scarlett, you wanted freedom. You got it. Now you and John can enjoy your life together. But remember, everything we built together stays with me. Good luck with your new relationship." Scarlett read the note over and over, unable to believe her eyes. "Did he really leave us?" she asked John, stunned. "Looks like it," John replied, but his smile was starting to fade. Scarlett began calling Nolan, but he didn't answer. She realized she had made a mistake, but it was too late. She had wanted to keep all her options open, but hadn't expected Nolan to leave the game so abruptly. In the following days, she tried to find a way to contact him, but he was nowhere to be found. The house was now in Nolan's name, and Scarlett realized she would have to find a new place to live. Moreover, custody of their child would go to Nolan because he was the one earning the money. On paper, Scarlett didn't have any direct income, not even as an investor in John's company. Nolan had done what Scarlett hadn't expected. He had taken control of the situation. His actions forced her to reflect on what she had lost and to realize that her idea of open relationships came with consequences. Now Nolan had a chance to start a new life, free from lies, betrayal, and people who didn't value him. What do you think? Did Nolan make the right decision by leaving Scarlett and taking everything they had built together?